Do you listen to any podcasts? If you're not already, you will be. In 2018, there was a reported 550,000 different podcasts. And right now, 51% of the U.S. population is listening to podcasts. And you can find a whopping 700,000 active podcasts online. That's more than 29 million episodes with content and more than 100 languages. And the people who are listening to the podcast have no clue that their privacy could be at risk. My next guest knows the ins and outs of all things podcasting. He's been at the forefront since 2004. I'm pleased to have my friend and VP of Podcast Relations for Libsyn, Rob Walch, joining us. And welcome to the show today, Rob.
Thanks for having me on.
So tell us, in all the podcasts that are available out there in the universe, what are some of the strangest ones that people might not be familiar with?
I think the Chameleon Breeder podcast, probably one of the stranger ones. It's just for people breeding chameleons.
And there's an audience for that?
Around 800 listeners per episode. Yeah, unbelievable. There is an audience. Another one, Backyard Beekeeping podcast, right? That really big audience on that one. So your audience is learning about birds and the bees right off the bat. So if you have a niche, there are podcasts for furries. The podcast niches are covered. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't start one.
How do people make money podcasting? I mean, here at the Komando Show and with our podcast, of course, we sell endorsements and we sell advertising. Is that still the traditional model?
That's one of them. I would say more people make money from building a brand, promoting a product or themselves as a product with the podcast. A lot of branded podcasts. Only about 7% of podcasts get to 5,000 downloads an episode. And that's kind of that magic number where you need to be for making money with advertising. So most podcasts never come close to that. Now, that's not to say you can't make money lower. There's other ways, Patreon and other donation models where people just ask, put out the hat and say, hey, donate to my show, $1 a show, help us out. And some podcasters make more money from that method than they do from advertising. Now, smart podcasters do both, advertising and donations. And those folks make the most money.
Yeah, and when we start talking about advertising, I mean, if we get into the online world in and of itself, is that, targeted ads will make more money than just generic ads. But in order to get the targeted ads is that you have to have a great deal of tracking. So that this way you know exactly who is going to see that ad and act upon it. Does that happen in the podcasting world?
Podcasting is different than the digital world. In the digital world, or the banner world, I should say, when you go to a website and there's a little checkbox down at the bottom that says, yes, I agree for you to track me and see what I do, right? I give up my privacy to you. Podcasting, you don't actually go to people's websites. When you subscribe to a podcast, and podcasts are powered by RSS feeds, but when you subscribe to a podcast, you're subscribing in Apple Podcast or Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast. And there's no option for you to opt in because you're not visiting the person's site. You're visiting this third-party aggregator app. So GDPR is a perfect example of laws that are in place that say you must opt in to be tracked. So when people want to track podcasters in Europe, it's against the law because there's no place for people to opt into that tracking. And that similar law goes into effect January 1st in California called CCPA.
So when you're talking about podcasting, is there some type of privacy policy that people are agreeing to?
They're not. The listeners don't have an option. Now, that doesn't mean people aren't tracking people. Unfortunately, there are companies that have come into this space in the last couple of years that have started to track listeners unbeknownst to the listeners. And that's an issue. It's one thing for you to track someone that says, yes, you can track me. That's okay, right? People have agreed to it. But when you track somebody that hasn't agreed to it, doesn't know they're being tracked, most people, 80% of the population, when asked about this, felt that was ethically wrong. So that's the listener saying, 80% saying that's just ethically wrong to track someone without letting them opt into that. So again, that doesn't mean it's not happening because the laws aren't in place. So if you live in Indiana right now, you can be tracked while listening to a podcast. If you live in Louisiana, you can be tracked. But in Italy, you won't be tracked. In January 1st, if you're in LA, supposedly you won't be tracked. A real world example of why that might be an issue is when people start tracking, that means this information goes into databases. And what happens to databases? Well, if they're valuable, one of two things we know happens. They're sold or they're hacked, oftentimes both. So if you start getting tracked and you didn't opt in, and let's say you listen to a cannabis podcast, now you're in this database that says you're a cannabis user because you listen to a cannabis podcast. Now you apply for a job a couple of years from now. Someone runs some AI in HR to see if they should hire you, and it flagged that you're a cannabis user, and nope, you're not going to get the job. Not because you have ever used cannabis, but because one day you listened to a cannabis podcast. And you can take this one level even worse. Let's say you listen to an LGBTQ podcast and you go to Dubai or some country where Sharia law is in place. And now you're in that database and you get tracked. And just Google lesbian couple being arrested in Dubai or in the Middle East, and you'll find some horror stories out there. That's where privacy becomes an issue, when people don't have the option to opt in to being tracked.
So is there anything that anybody can do right now, or is this just the way that it's operating right now?
It's up to the podcasters and the podcast companies to say, no, we're not going to allow people to be tracked. I work for Libsyn, and we say that, no, everybody's privacy is important, whether you're in Indiana or Italy. So we won't work with any companies that track listeners unless they have an option to opt in, which we know in podcasting they don't. So basically we're saying there's no tracking of user IP address information, sharing of user IP address information at all for anybody that works with Libsyn, period. And that's our policy. We hope other podcast companies will take the same route. We know others definitely are not, and they are tracking. But if you listen to a podcast that's hosted on Libsyn, like your show, your listeners are not being tracked. They're not being added to a database, and that's our pledge. And we're gonna. That's we've been in this space before anyone. We're gonna continue down that road, and we hope other companies will join us and say, we're not going to allow any third parties to track and share IP address, personal information of listeners, period.
Well, I'll tell you, Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you and Libsyn over the years. I mean, you guys, you really have your act together. And thanks so much for sharing your wealth of podcast knowledge with us today. And speaking of podcasts, as Rob mentioned, I have the perfect one you might want to check out. It's called Komando on Demand. You don't want to miss it. You can get on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, on Alexa, Spotify, or wherever you do get your podcasts. Just search for my name, Kim Komando, with a K, of course. Hey, thanks for watching. Now, a few things. Don't forget to click the like button and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. And for more digital know-how, check out all these other great links.